Picture this, it's 1914, and Europe is literally the most advanced, incredibly wealthy, and scientifically brilliant civilization in all of human history. They are at the absolute peak of their power. They're dominating global culture, trade, innovation, you name it. They have absolutely every reason to just keep the good times rolling. So why on earth did they decide, seemingly out of nowhere, to just burn the whole thing to the ground?
But before continuing, we upload new history videos every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
No, seriously, think about the sheer contrast here. On one side, you've got these incredibly rich, globe-spanning colonial empires that are practically bathing in wealth and scientific triumphs. And on the exact same stage, the impending doom of a catastrophic global war. A war that would shatter millions of lives and literally erase entire empires off the map forever. It's the ultimate historical paradox.
By 1914, the world comes crashing down. In this explainer, we're basically going to watch a bomb being built from scratch. We'll track the geopolitical dominoes across 5 steps: a continent ready to burn, Bismarck's new order, a deadly alliance web, a great naval arms race, and the final spark.
Step 1, a continent ready to burn, the peak of power.
So right before the collapse, these great powers were fiercely ambitious, and they were constantly looking to expand their reach. The board is set with the heavyweights: the German Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Imperial Russia. We are talking about colossal empires with massive economies and sprawling territories all over the globe. And you know, when giants of this massive scale start dancing in a crowded room, eventually someone is going to get crushed.
Step 2. Bismarck's fragile new order. Engineering peace.
Okay, let's dive into this. It really all started with Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. After unifying Germany in 1871, he tried to maintain peace by, well, basically spinning plates. He engineered this brilliant but incredibly fragile system of treaties. But then, in 1890, the hot-headed Kaiser Wilhelm II fires him, and almost immediately, Bismarck's absolute worst nightmare comes true: the 1894 Franco-Russian alliance. Just like that, Germany is trapped with enemies on both sides.
Step 3. The deadly alliance web. Picking sides. With Bismarck's careful system completely in ruins, the continent starts splitting into these rigid, opposing blocks. On one side, we've got the Triple Entente: Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, don't think of these as just dry, boring diplomatic treaties. Think of this as a super deadly group chat. If you insult one person, the entire group jumps in to retaliate. A threat against one nation instantly became a threat against all of them. No one could afford to back down.
The twilight of the Habsburgs. This quote right here is absolutely crucial to understanding the whole dynamic. See, Germany had shackled itself to Austria-Hungary, which was this decaying, weary empire deeply struggling with massive internal divisions. They were desperately trying to hold on to their relevance. Yet, Germany tied its fate to them anyway, essentially acting as the muscle for a dying giant.
Step 4. The Great Naval Arms Race, the Weary Titan versus the Risk Fleet.
Meanwhile, out at sea, a massive rivalry was brewing. Germany made this entirely unnecessary push to challenge the Weary Titan. That's the massive but kind of overstretched British Empire. Germany's grand strategy was called the Risk Fleet. The idea? Build a navy just big enough to scare Britain into backing off and conceding global power. Well, it completely backfired. Instead of making Britain back down, it terrified them and actually pushed them right into an alliance with France.
1906. Pinpoint this exact year, because this is the moment the British totally changed the game by launching the HMS Dreadnought. This ship was so massive, so heavily armed, and so incredibly fast that it instantly made literally every other battleship on Earth entirely obsolete. In this crazy, cruel twist of irony, Britain essentially made its own previous fleet obsolete just to stay ahead. It reset the entire global naval race back to zero and kicked it into absolute overdrive.
And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next. Between 1900 and 1914, this turned into a massive, ego-driven arms race. Both of these empires were just pouring astronomical, economy-draining amounts of money into building bigger and bigger ships. It was a terrifying global poker game, with both sides desperately racing to see who could stack the most floating steel out on the water.
Step 5. The final spark. Crises and brinkmanship.
So the explosives are now fully laid, the alliances are locked in, the armies are massive, and the years leading up to 1914 were just a terrifying series of near misses before the inevitable detonation. Like in 1905 during the First Moroccan Crisis, Germany deliberately tried to test the waters and break up that new alliance between France and Britain. But instead, the shared fear of Germany accidentally drove the lion and the bear much, much closer together.
Then comes 1908, a dress rehearsal in Bosnia. Austria-Hungary recklessly decides to just annex Bosnia outright. This deeply, deeply angered Imperial Russia, who saw themselves as the ultimate protector of the region's Slavic people. This one reckless move brought the entire continent to the absolute brink of war. It was a massive, flashing red flag of exactly what was to come.
So here is your explosive cocktail. You have extreme military spending just draining the treasuries, you have ironclad alliances locking everyone into opposing corners, and you have massive imperial hubris. Armies are huge, no nation can step back without completely losing face on the world stage, and the leaders in charge, well, they're entirely too overconfident in their ability to somehow control this chaos. By the eve of 1914, it was in ever-present danger. The tension gripping Europe wasn't just some simple political disagreement anymore. It was a permanent, suffocating state of geopolitical anxiety. Literally everyone knew a war was coming. They just didn't know exactly what would trigger it.
The powder keg is completely full. The nations are armed to the teeth. The deadly alliance webs are drawn in stone, and these massive empires are desperate to prove their dominance. The stage is perfectly set for the greatest catastrophe in human history. We are staring right at the brink of destruction, and the only question left is, who will light the match?
Have you ever thought about World War I and pictured it as just a sudden, tragic accident? Well, what if I told you the peace of Europe was literally engineered to fail? It wasn't a random explosion. If you look closely at the years right before the war, you'll uncover something absolutely terrifying. We're talking about a giant, unstoppable doomsday machine, deliberately assembled piece by piece. Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine it's between 1911 and 1914, and 5 major empires are sitting down to a deadly, high-stakes scheme of geopolitical poker. And the crazy thing? Every single one of them believed they held a winning hand. They weren't just reacting to random events, They were executing these massive, incredibly rigid blueprints for victory. Blueprints that left absolutely zero room for peace. So let's look at the warning signs in our first section. Cascading crisis. Europe during this time was basically a house of cards swaying in a hurricane. Just look at how rapidly these warning signs fired off. First, in 1911, you have the Agadir crisis. The Germans deliberately challenged the French in Morocco. It's literally like tossing a lit match into a dry forest just to see what happens. Then, practically overlapping that, we see the Italo-Turkish War, directly followed by the brutally violent Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. These weren't just isolated little incidents. Every single one of these localized conflicts normalized violence, redrew the maps, and pushed the European powder keg one massive step closer to total detonation. And here's the thing, even when the guns briefly stopped, the diplomatic standoffs sure didn't. Take the Lehmann von Saunders affair, for example. On the surface, yeah, a dispute over a German military mission in the Ottoman Empire might just sound like minor bureaucratic friction. But in this hypersensitive environment, it was a critical, dangerous crisis. It kept the great powers, especially Russia and Germany, right at each other's throats. The temperature in the room never actually went down. It just stabilized at a boiling point. Which brings us to our next piece of the puzzle, the Great Arms Race and the economics of destruction. And this brilliantly illustrates the terrifying double reality of the time. While tensions are boiling over, these empires began building the massive economic engines needed for the coming slaughter. In public, you've got the total illusion of peacetime diplomacy. Politicians smiling, shaking hands, posing for cameras. But in the shadows, aggressive, relentless wartime armament buildups. Steel production absolutely skyrocketed. Artillery factories were running day and night. Standing armies swelled to numbers the world had literally never seen before. They were speaking the language of peace while printing the currency of war. Now you might be wondering, what was the ultimate trigger for this massive arms race? Well, it was the Russian resurgence. After some pretty humiliating defeats a decade earlier, the Russian Empire didn't just rebuild, they completely supercharged their military. Watching this colossal Eastern giant wake up absolutely terrified rival nations. It acted as the ultimate pressure cooker. For Germany and others, the clock was ticking loud and clear. If they didn't act soon, this newly armed Russian bear was going to be unstoppable. So how did they plan to deal with this? let's look at the master war plans, the 5 hands of geopolitical poker. This intense, shared fear completely forged the core machinery of the war. Every great power completely abandoned the idea of defense and shifted to highly aggressive, offensive blueprints. Hand number 1, Russia. Their strategy? It was all about massive scale. They planned to leverage their newly resurgent military and their enormous population to create an overwhelming multi-front Eastern juggernaut. Think of it like a giant human steamroller. The whole plan relied on absorbing any initial shocks with their sheer vastness, mobilizing millions of soldiers, and just crushing the opposition under the immense weight of an endless advance. Then we have hand number 2, Germany. So the absolute crucial point here is that Germany knew, for a fact, they couldn't fight both Russia and France at the exact same time in a long, drawn-out war. It just wouldn't work. So their war plan became this desperate, high-speed mathematical calculation. Because of that terrifying Russian resurgence we just talked about, Germany believed they had a rapidly shrinking window of time. Their entire strategy hinged on delivering a lightning-fast knockout blow to France in the west and then immediately pivoting their forces east to meet that slower-moving Russian steamroller. Speed wasn't just a tactic for them, it was literally their only hope for survival. Moving on to hand number 3, Austria. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was sprawling, multi-ethnic, and honestly incredibly fragile. Their war plans were hyper-focused on internal and border preservation. They needed targeted, localized dominance, especially down in the highly volatile Balkans, just to prevent their entire empire from fracturing into pieces. For them, the plan was basically a high-stakes game of whack-a-mole, crush localized threats with overwhelming regional force so they could somehow maintain those imperial borders. Hand number 4, France. The French had spent decades stewing over previous defeats by Germany, right? So their war plan reflected this deep psychological need to reclaim lost national glory. They had absolutely no intention of just sitting behind fortresses. Their plan was a 100% commitment to a pure, aggressive, relentless forward infantry push. It was known as the cult of the offensive. It was this intense belief that overwhelming fighting spirit and a massive forward charge would shatter literally any defensive line. And finally, hand number 5, Great Britain. Secure over on their island, the British master plan played perfectly to their historic strengths. They were going to utilize their completely unmatched naval supremacy to blockade enemies and utterly dominate the seas. Meanwhile, they deploy these highly trained strategic continental expeditionary forces. We're talking small, precise ground armies designed not to conquer huge chunks of land, but to strategically tip the scales of power in Europe exactly where and when it was needed most. Let's move to our final section and see how all of this builds up in Europe's final years, from 1912 to 1914. By this point, the board was completely set. We've got the crises, the massive weapon stockpiles, and these 5 rigid master plans. Put them all together, and you've created a literal machinery of inevitability. Just think about how these ingredients interact. The Agadir and Balkan crises, they've made war feel normal, maybe even expected. The armament economies have reached completely unsustainable peaks. I mean, you can't just build millions of artillery shells forever without eventually using them, right? And most dangerously of all, those 5 rigid offensive war plans are locked firmly into place. Because every single one of those plans relied on striking first or mobilizing the fastest, any tiny spark would force everyone to activate their plans all at once. There was absolutely no reverse gear built into this machine. All of this deadly mathematics, the crazy arms races, the rigid timetables, and all that simmering diplomatic paranoia, it all converges on a single number. One specific day that would change the trajectory of human history forever. 28. As the sun set on June 28, 1914, the doomsday machine was fully powered up. All 5 master plans were locked, loaded, and just waiting for an excuse. Germany is waiting to sprint west. Russia is massing in the east. France is eager to charge forward. Austria is desperate to crush the Balkans. And Britain is watching closely from the seas. So the real question isn't exactly how the war started, but rather, what happens when the final fatal spark actually hits a powder keg that took years to perfectly assemble? Well, that is exactly where the infamous July crisis begins. And that's a story you are absolutely not going to want to miss. Keep questioning the mechanics of history and
Picture a world literally bursting with absolute optimism, humming with industry and totally oblivious that it's about to step right off a cliff. There was no slow, gradual decline. Just one gunshot in the summer of 1914, a sudden, violent snap, and millions of lives are instantly forfeited. So how did one single summer plunge an entire century into darkness? We usually look at history like it's just a bunch of dates neatly packed away in old textbooks. But what if the world you were standing in, literally right now, the borders, the geopolitics, our modern anxieties, was fundamentally shattered and rebuilt by just a few fateful weeks? You really cannot understand today without understanding the catastrophic ripple effect of what happened next.
To grasp the sheer scale of this collapse, we have to travel back to the moment the old world order drew its final breath. Part 1. The lights go out.
Okay, let's dive into this. 1914. It isn't just a year. It is a hard dividing line in human history. Europe was actually gearing up for what pretty much everyone assumed would be a swift, decisive skirmish. But thanks to this massive tripwire of huge empires and intricate binding alliances, the gears of war, once they were in motion, absolutely could not be stopped. The world was immediately put on a timer.
The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. That was British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey, watching the continent accelerate straight toward the abyss. Now, it sounds super poetic, but it wasn't just him being dramatic. It was a terrifyingly accurate prediction of a permanent civilizational blackout. He knew, right then, that the light of the 19th century world was being extinguished forever.
And, well, he was absolutely right. Because what replaced that light wasn't just some political reshuffling, it was an absolute nightmare. Let's step out of the dimly lit halls of diplomacy and straight into Part 2, Horror in the Mud.
The conflict escalated with such unprecedented, terrifying scale that it simply became known as the Great War. This was a catastrophic 4-year global conflict that utterly shattered any initial optimism of a quick victory. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of the modern world. I mean, imagine an entire generation marching off in these bright, flashy 19th century uniforms only to meet 20th century machine guns. They ended up just being swallowed by the earth.
And the sheer scale of these bloodbaths, it literally defies logic. The Battle of the Somme saw tens of thousands fall in a single day. Think about that. Verdun was designed as a literal meat grinder, meant to bleed an entire nation white through relentless attrition. Ypres introduced absolute horror in the mud, where poison gas turned the environment itself into a weapon. This was not a war of brilliant heroic cavalry charges. This was a war of brutal endurance, just trying to survive in waterlogged trenches alongside the fallen.
But the true terror of this conflict is that the devastation didn't just magically stop when the artillery finally went quiet. We have to pull back and look at the massive overarching consequences here. Part 3. The global unease. As the dust settled, a totally traumatized world desperately tried to brand this nightmare the war to end war. It was this hopeful moniker, right? A plea to the universe that such suffering could never possibly happen twice. But the reality that actually followed was the impossible peace. The treaties didn't resolve the tensions at all. They just repackaged them, punishing the losers and creating this simmering, toxic global unease that infected all the decades to come.
Let's move through the timeline and see how this builds, because it paints a really grim picture. The outbreak in 1914, the silence of the guns in 1918, but that gap between 1918 and 1939, that wasn't true peace. It was literally just an intermission. Those 2 decades of global unease were fueled directly by the unresolved trauma of the Great War, making the eruption of World War II in 1939 an absolute inevitability. The fire wasn't put out, it was just smoldering underground.
The really terrifying part is that the consequences of those 4 years of absolute destruction were just way too vast for any one generation to handle. Men like Sir Edward Grey, who watched those lamps go out, passed away long before the chaotic ripples of their decisions ever settled. The political and social ramifications of that one single war basically dictated the fate of the entire 20th century.
Which brings us away from the history books and right up to the doorstep of our current reality. Part 4. A century-long shadow. It is super easy to look at black and white photos of guys in trenches and just brush it off as distant history. But make no mistake, we are all living in the shadow of the Great War. The collapse of entire empires, the arbitrary drawing of borders in the modern Middle East, the massive shifts in global superpowers, even the psychological trauma that birthed modern art and literature, it all traces straight back to the mud of the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres. The world was broken apart and glued back together entirely differently.
So, I want to leave you with this. If a single summer in 1914 could completely reshape an entire century, sweeping away the old world order in a blink, how is today's world still being silently directed by the shadows of the Great War? Next time you look at a modern map,
or read a crazy headline about geopolitical tension, just remember, the lamps that went out in 1914 never really came back on. We just learned to navigate in a very different kind of light.